But Joe, man, you're going to get some major spotlight now because we got a section for Joe. Joe's got comic recommendations. Now, before we get into people, this is an anime and manga podcast. We all talk about anime and manga, but as I just went on my little tirade just a couple of seconds ago, I'm open to everything. Now, Joe's got a list of comics that he highly recommends. Now, I'm really happy he's brought this to our attention because everything he's recommended to me from the anime and some of the other stuff he's recommended to me, I've been happy with. So I trust his opinion. I'll be putting the links to everything he's mentioning in the podcast post. So if you want to know where to get them, come to our thread on planettyro.com. Check out this episode. I've put all the links in the description. So it's about that time, people. Our trusted advisor, Kimono Joe, is going to give us some cool-ass comic recommendations, people. This is going to be a lengthy experience, about an hour's worth of solid recommendations from the entire comic spectrum, people. And to do this shit in its proper form, I'm going to give my man Kimono Joe a nice little intro to get things rolling. Joe, I'm going to step back and watch from afar. Let's do this!
I'm going to have a huge reading list for you. Don't worry, this isn't going to be like a homework assignment. These are all going to be good books to check out. I have my entire list broken down into a few categories. I'm going to start off with superheroes. Like, even though we've had a few moments where we sound like we're bashing on superheroes, but there is some good stuff out there, and that's what I want you people to know about. I'm going to start with, of course, the big two from Marvel and DC. Then I'm going to jump down to lesser-known books from other publishers, which some publishers you may not even know about until now. Then after those superhero ones, I'm going to break into other genres. That one, I'm going a little looser with my publishers and just doing basically genre-based alone. Alright, without further ado, I'm going to start off with a book called Hawkeye by Matt Fraction and David Aja. Now, if you've been seeing like Hawkeye from the Marvel Avengers film and you thought that dude was badass and you want to know a comic book to get, pick up this book. It's recently just came out and it's a fun, really interesting take on it because it's less over-the-top superhero drama and more just about the life of a dude who fights with a bow and arrow among a superhero team with gods, basically. And the art style by David Aja, it's really fantastic because it's a lot of like really stylized, intricate looking, almost kind of pop art style. It's really fantastic. The next one is Daredevil by Mark Waid and Pablo Rivera. Now, this was a departure because earlier beforehand, Daredevil, ever since about the 80s or so, has been a very dark book with Frank Miller from Brian Michael Bendis and then Ed Brubaker. All these guys who did really good runs all had a very dark and depressing, how far can we take this guy's life and ruin it take on Daredevil.
And he's blind. They had no mercy for him.
Yeah, like there's a lot of shit that happened to it. Like the whole thing of anyone he loves ends up being attacked and all this crazy shit. However, Mark Waid and Pablo Rivera, when they got on the book, they introduced something that hadn't been seen in a long time with Daredevil, and that's the element of fun. Because he's Daredevil, a guy without fear. So they take this and they put more of him as a swashbuckling hero like he was originally. They don't ignore what came before it. They actually even address it to a point. Like, some people are even questioning, why the hell are you so happy all the time? And he's saying, hey, I'm sick of being in the rain all the time. Sometimes you gotta be in the sunlight. And which is a good way of seeing it. Like, what they're doing is a lot of fun, it's really entertaining, but also they tell really great and creative stories with Daredevil. Plus, Paulo Rivera, he has a really interesting way of depicting how Daredevil's sensory powers work. Like, if you don't know people who Daredevil is, he's blind, but he has super heightened senses, so he might as well be able to see just with sights and smells and whatnot. And how they show that working, it's really interesting to see. So, the next one is Young Avengers, which is a little bit of an old and new book that came out. This is a new series by Karen Gillian and Jane McKelvey. And what this book is, it's a sequel in a sense, or whatever you want to refer it to as. But this was a team of young superheroes that was introduced a couple of years back. And this new take on it is actually a really interesting kind of idea of what the youth culture is like today. And it's actually a really fun story, as basically it's the idea of young kids having to fight adults. Only in this take of it, it's these young heroes who end up accidentally awakening this weird parasite known as Mother from another dimension that can seemingly affect human beings who are parents around their kids, or something crazy like that. I know it sounds weird, but trust me on it, it's actually a really fun take on the book. Now, if you don't want to start with that just yet, this is an older recommendation, but you can go back and read the previous Young Avengers book by Alan Heinberg and Jim Chung. Now, this one is a little bit different from the current Young Avengers book, in that this one was a bit more serious. Like, the premise was, the Avengers had disbanded after this big event happened. Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, they no longer wanted anything to do with each other. So, suddenly there are these young heroes appearing that are dressed up exactly like them, only just kid versions. Like, you have a kid named the Patriot, you got Iron Lad, Hulkling, and Wiccan. And people are wondering, well, who are these kids, and why do they call themselves the Young Avengers? And what starts out as like what seems like these kids with good-hearted intentions, you start learning about that there is a bigger plot going along, especially with one of them who is holding in a dangerous secret about his future. Trust me, that one, just as well, it's a good one to start with, but you can choose either one you want to start with. So, after that, we got The Incredible Hercules by Greg Pak, Fred Van Lente, and Corey Pham. Now, this was a spin-off from another event called World War Hulk. I don't know if you've ever seen the animated film Planet Hulk.
I have, and I know people hated it, but I actually really liked it, and I wanted to see the sequel where, sorry to spoil it, people, his whole shit gets fucked over and he comes back to Earth for revenge. Yeah. It's like, I can't wait to see that. Sorry to get excited, people. I'm looking forward to them animating that, because I've heard they've wanted to do that for a while, even though I know people did not like that movie.
Oh, yeah. Well, you see, the comic book version of World War Hulk, it had a spin-off where they were focusing on an older character, which is Hercules, the actual Greek god myth. Now, in this, he's teaming up with a character that the guy Greg Pak invented years ago, a guy named Amadeus Cho, who has been dubbed the 7th smartest person in the world. That being that this kid is insanely so smart with like mathematics and physics and whatnot that he could stop a tank with a pebble just by placing it in the right area.
Okay.
It's really crazy, but they do show how his mind works, and it's really interesting to see. But him and Hercules are teaming up, so it's basically a brains and bronze type thing. And it's a whole lot of fun, because Hercules, he's a dude who's been around for the longest time, and he loves two things, fighting and getting drunk. And the two of them are pretty much on the run from the S.H.I.E.L.D. agency because of this gets a little bit complicated, but heroes have been outlawed from a previous event called Civil War. So these two are basically on the run and trying to make their way through everything that's going on in this crazy Marvel world while trying to stay one step ahead of their enemies.
Okay.
Yeah. But like I said, it's a whole lot of fun. Alright. Next, Runaways. Now this is a book by Brian K. Vaughan and Alphon. Brian K. Vaughan, if you don't know, he was a writer on the show Lost, which I never personally watched, but a lot of people always talked highly about the episodes he worked on. And this one, I would say, is probably a good start for anyone who is so unfamiliar with the Marvel universe, because this introduces a whole new line of characters. The premise of it is that every year these 6 kids would meet up because their parents were all like part of some benefit charity thing, and so they would just meet up every year, hang out, not knowing what their parents did. Until one day, they decided to go find out what is it our parents do during these meetings. And they find out their parents are performing human sacrifices. These kids all find out that apparently they are the children of supervillains, essentially. And that their parents have been living ordinary lives, hiding all this stuff, and that they're working to this bigger plan that they don't know anything about. So, these kids, with no other option, they decide to just run away from their parents. And from that, they also are starting to learn a lot about themselves. Like, one of them finds out that all this time, she's been an alien. They got one character who finds out her parents have been time travelers. We got another one who also finds out that she has like dark magic built up inside of her that her parents have put inside there. And so it's about them trying to figure out what to do with their lives and what to do with their parents as well.
Actually, can I just ask, these recommendations, most of them like self-contained? Are most of them finished, or are some of them still ongoing?
The Runaways is currently kind of finished, but I would say don't read anything that's not by Brian K. Vaughan, only because it's kind of weaker from where it was. Because he did an initial run, and he told his story, and it was actually really good.
Okay, I just wanted you to mention that for some people who not sure if it's ongoing or...
Yeah. Some of these books, it is, again, you gotta just follow the creator and see their name on it.
You just recommend. I mean, we can't do all the work for the people. Just recommend and then let them do the rest of the work. Oh. I'm sorry, people, to be an arsehole, but, there's only so much we can do. You can take a horse to the water. That's the saying.
Oh, yeah.
My audiences are not horses. I'm sorry if I offended you people. We love you. Continue, Joe. I didn't mean to stop you there.
Oh, yeah. Also, one thing I forgot to mention, though, is if you can't find these books on Amazon, because some of them are out of print and might be difficult to get, look up on sites like Comixology or the Marvel Unlimited. I'm sure no matter what, they're going to be there somewhere. All right. So next book up is The Immortal Iron Fist by Ed Brubaker, Matt Fraction, and David Aja. So you're also going to see this a lot of people. I'm going to be repeating some creators' names. That's how you know that these are the good people to follow. The Immortal Iron Fist, you don't really need to know anything about this character. He was a Marvel superhero in the 70s, but this is a new take on it. It's kind of like a really gritty crime noir mixed with kung fu and fantasy action. And really fantastic art, again, by the guy David Aja. Only this one, this was earlier work by him, and it has more of a calligraphy art style to it that really fits the mood and tone of the book. So, another fantastic book to follow. Next up is the start of what Ed Brubaker and artist Steve Epting did with Captain America. If you've seen the Captain America movie and you're wondering about the next one that's coming out known as The Winter Soldier, these are the guys that wrote that story that movie is going to be based on. So what we have is Captain America finding out ghosts from the past as a character known as the Winter Soldier, who he has been having constant battles with over and over again. He finally finds out who this guy is and what happened to his partner Bucky so many years ago. This is a good start, and Ed Brubaker did a pretty good run on Captain America. I will say near towards the end, he started to kind of falter, but I think that was more that Marvel wanted him to stay on the book longer than he actually wanted to. But still, regardless, really good stuff to check out. Alright, next one is a book called XFactor. Now, XFactor is loosely related to the X-Men series, but not entirely much. XFactor is a group of mutants that run a detective agency. And this is I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, this is being written by Peter David and Sook. Since these are lesser known mutant characters in the X-Men universe, they're able to tell more interesting stories, and they're not hampered down by all the big events and whatnot. Now, granted, every so often they have to do an event tie-in, and that's where the book does get a little bit weak. But the actual character interaction and the story that these guys tell is really good. Like, the comic itself recently just wrapped up, and this had been going on for like a good couple of years with the same writer, at least. There was a few moments where the artist changed out and it was someone who was not so good, but other than that, it's still a fantastic book series to check out. And also, there's just some really, really funny-ass moments in it because they build up on a lot of moments in it. So, next is Thor the Mighty Avenger by Stephen Langridge and Chris Samney. This one is not connected. Like, as we talked about, like, what's continuity, what's not. This is technically not continuity. This was supposed to be a all-ages Thor book for whenever the Thor movie came out, because with any property, whenever a movie comes out, they got to release, like, 10 billion books to it to capitalize on it. This was one of the few that was actually really, really good. Like, this is kind of like a different take on Thor's origins. Unfortunately, it did not get to last long. Like, this was kind of like the same thing that happened to Joss Whedon's Firefly, in that it had a really good story, but it got canceled prematurely. They were able to at least finish up their first story that they were telling, but it just kind of leaves you with that whole thing, I wanted more. But regardless, it's still a really, really good book to read.
Sounds cool.
Alright. Next up is Annihilation. This was a comic book event in Marvel, but it didn't take place on Earth. This is all cosmic level characters. This is where you get the Silver Surfer, you get Nova, and all these other characters that are all predominantly in space. Now, if you know anything about the upcoming Guardians of the Galaxy movie, this is where it all originated from these characters and what's been out of it. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but you can find it on Comixology. That much I do know, and it is a really fantastic book. I will say they have like 4-issue stories that all play a key role in the event, and then they have the event itself. Now, some of those individual character issues were not so good. They had one about the Super Skrull and Ronan the Accuser, which they weren't great, but they weren't bad either. Overall, Annihilation was fantastic, and when you finish that, then there's so much more to read on about it if you do enjoy it, such as Annihilation Conquest, which was its sequel, and then that's when you get into the Guardians of the Galaxy that spun out of it. I know it's a little daunting, people, but trust me, that one, I went into that knowing barely anything about the characters, and I ended up loving them more than I loved any other character for the longest time.
It's all daunting, Joe. It's all daunting.
I feel like I'm a crazy person right now.
My friend, some people want this. Trust me.
Okay.
Trust me. This is what it's like having your own podcast. So keep going. I'm listening. I know I'm being quiet, people. I'm still here. So we both appreciate you checking it out. But Joe, keep running the race, man. Keep going.
Okay. So next we have Ultimate Spider-Man. This one, again, is not a book that's in canon. This was a book by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley. This started out early in 2000, this was the idea of what if Spider-Man's origin happened now and not in the 60s? which it didn't turn out into a complete rehash. They did actually change up a lot of things about it. Like, they do still keep the basic, like that he gets bit by the spider, his uncle dies, all that. But they don't adhere to the old stuff, like his aunt isn't this doddering old lady who faints all the time. She's actually an actual adult that has a job to attend to and a child to raise, basically. But also, there is just like more of a relationship status about Peter Parker and like all of his friends and everything else. It's really good. However, if you've seen that Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon and realize that show is awful, do not worry. This has absolutely nothing to do with that horrid cartoon.
Well, let me just ask you, because I'm interested. This sounds kind of like the Amazing Spider-Man. Is that where they got this idea from at all?
Probably. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised because the Ultimate Spider-Man comic book, it's still ongoing now. However, I don't know if you recall, but they recently had this big shakeup in the news about how Spider-Man's now black.
Yeah, they've gone on about that so much, even on Spill, Mexican or something, half black, and apparently the original one's dead, but, as in all comic books, they always bring them back, just like what Spider-Man's now, Doc Ock, trapped in his mind and all that other crazy shit.
Well, that's actually a thing, though. Like, I'm sorry, people, that was a bit of a spoiler, though, but it does reach a point where Ultimate Spider-Man does die, but there is kind of the question that he's probably not going to come back because there's already other Spider-Man. Since he's not an in-canon character, he probably doesn't matter nearly as much.
Yes, sorry, you are. I've heard a lot of comic people say that in the Ultimates, when characters die, they actually don't come back. So yeah, sorry about that.
It's all right. Still, people, all good, worth checking out. Okay, so that's all from Marvel for right now. Like I said, people, this is a long list, so.
How far are you now? 50%?
Okay.
I'll take that as a no. But don't worry, just keep going, Joe.
All right, so now we're moving over to DC. Now, I hopped on a lot about how terrible this new 52 stuff is, which it is. It's truly awful crap. However, that doesn't mean there's not a few hidden gems in there to check out. The big two that I'm still enjoying right now is Animal Man, being written by Jeff Lemire and Travel Foreman, and Swamp Thing by Scott Snyder and Yannick Paquette. The thing is, both of these books are kind of less superheroes and a little bit more horror-based in a way, because these two do kind of have a crossover story between the two of them, because there's a much larger story going on. Basically, they're saying that Swamp Thing is an avatar for this elemental force known as the green, Animal Man is the elemental force of life, which is the red, and that they are both combating an elemental force known as the rot, which their whole goal is that they want to destroy all life so that there can be nothing but death. Now, the two of them, they do have their own separate stories, but then they converge onto a story arc known as the Rot World. And honestly, it did get a little long in the tooth, but it has since then picked up for it, so it is a really good book overall. Now, it's those two, which if you gotta get one, unfortunately, people, you gotta get the other one, though, because they do tie in so heavily with each other. Now, the next book is Wonder Woman, and this one's being written by Brian Azzarello and drawn by Cliff Chiang. This one is one of the few exceptions about DC doing a reboot that works, because with their other books, they didn't change a damn thing about it. Wonder Woman in this one is pretty much one of the best interpretations I've seen of Wonder Woman in a really, really long time. They do show her as the independent, strong, badass, warrior woman that she is, but also that she is the person who does care for life around her and her friends that are with her and all that. The story of this one, it's a little bit not so much focused on her origin, actually, where basically this young woman is being the target for a bunch of attacks. One of the most notable ones is that she's attacked by centaurs, and Wonder Woman ends up having to save her from it. Turns out that this young woman had a one-night stand with a guy at some truck stop. She didn't even know anything about him. Turns out it was Zeus. And that Hera, being Hera, jealous of any woman that has sex with Zeus, is now committed to kill this woman and the child that she's pregnant with. So it's a little dark, but trust me, it's a good one. Alright. So now moving on to, these are older books. These are pre-New 52 books. There's a large majority of them that might be out of print. So it might take a little bit of time, or you might have to go on the Comixology to get them. But these are all worth checking out. All right. We talked a little bit about this beforehand, but All-Star Superman.
Yes.
Yes. So basically, if you haven't seen the animated feature, like the premise of it is that in the very beginning, Lex Luthor sets up this big elaborate plot to try to end Superman. And his goal is that he basically gives Superman a deteriorating condition that's pretty much essentially cancer. So Superman has a limited time left on Earth. But instead of being like a mopey thing about like facing mortality and whatnot, instead this is a story about Superman wanting to leave the world in a place to where it will be okay after he's gone. In a way, this is Superman setting up all of his everything so that the world will be ready when he's gone. It's a really fantastic book, and I think one of the best representations of what Superman is in my book.
Couldn't agree more. But I should also mention that he's more powerful in this story than he's ever been, ever.
I forgot, they did mention that just a little bit, that the condition he has, while it's killing him, it does make him stronger than he has been before. Really fantastic book. All right. Next up is called Superman's Secret Identity. Now, this one as well is not an in-canon book. This is actually a really interesting premise. This takes place in our world, the real world in a sense, where Superman is a comic book character icon. And what it is that there is a kid who lives in a town called Smallville, and his parents named him Clark Kent because their last name was Kent, and they thought it would be kind of a funny thing, like, oh, we named our son Clark Kent, like Superman, ha ha ha. Yeah. So, this thing is, this guy has gone throughout his entire life of people making that joke around him, until one day he discovers he actually does have superpowers. He is essentially Superman. And from there, it's a story about him in the world as he's like learning about everything to it. And also, like, what does it mean being a superhero? What does it mean having your own identity? And like, can you trust people when you got like these powers of a god? Can you be around people? It's a really, really fascinating and interesting story. There is a few weird kind of plot elements, but trust me, it's a good book. Especially if you don't want anything continuity heavy. This is all self-contained, one volume. It's great.
Sounds like my kind of book.
Oh, yeah. All right, next one up is Hitman by Garth Ennis and Greg McCree. Now, Hitman was a weird byproduct of an event DC did called Bloodline, where their whole gimmick was that they were going to introduce a bunch of new characters. Hitman was pretty much the only guy that actually managed to survive out of all these new characters. Hitman was just a guy who was an average assassin who just did mob jobs every so often. He ends up being attacked by these alien parasites that was part of this whole big event prior. And it leaves him, like, he lived, but it had effect on him to where he can now hear people's thoughts, but he can also see through objects. Like, he essentially has X-ray vision. So basically, he starts using these to his advantage to become an even better assassin. It's actually like a really pretty funny book. He gets targeted at one point that someone wants him to go put a hit out on the Joker. And so before he goes there, everyone's like telling him, hey, since you're going to Arkham, can you also do me these favors? Like, can you pop the Mad Hatter in a kneecap and tell him that Jimmy said no more? Or something crazy like that. I know I'm doing a bad job reinterpreting it, people. But trust me, this isn't like your average superhero book. This is actually a really fun kind of take on it. And I believe it's 6 volumes long, and so it is all finished. And like I said, it's a really good book. All right. So next up is Secret Six. This is by a woman named Gail Simone and Nicola Scott. And this one was also another book that spun out of an event. You don't need to really read it that much. The premise of it is that this is a group of supervillains. Well, they don't really view themselves too much as supervillains, but they are working as essentially a form of mercenaries. Basically, you got a team that consists of Deadshot, Catman, Mad Hatter, Scandal, Ragdoll, and a woman named Knockout. And basically, this is a team of mercenaries that go and do various odd jobs for other villains. It's a really interesting character study on these because these are like pretty horrible people that do awful things, but you do see like a very interesting human side to them. And it's not like so wishy-washy that they make them promote them as heroes of their own story. No, they're still villains. You know that straight off. But you get to understand them and see life through their point of view. Alright. Now this one is a much older book, but trust me, it's worth checking out. It's called Justice League International. This was by Keith Giffen, Doug Medias, and Kevin Maguire. Now, Justice League International, basically, this was what people referred to most of the time as the funny version of the Justice League, because these guys writing it, they did make a more humorous book to it. And this one wasn't a team that consisted of like Batman and Wonder Woman. That was actually a joke about it, that they weren't allowed to use a lot of these characters. So they got left with like the B-string heroes, which it consisted of Guy Gardner, Green Lantern, Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, Martian Manhunter, and various other characters. And basically, it's just a really ridiculous book as this guy named Maxwell Lord tries to set up this whole thing of making a team of superheroes to be on each continent. Like, they were trying to popularize the idea of superheroes. And it's actually really funny and well written. And there is a lot of dark moments into it, though. But it's like one of those things, as I mentioned, you can have dark moments so long as you balance it out with some comedy to it. But like I said, it's old, but it's really good. All right. Next up is a book called Batman, the Black Mirror. This is a book by Scott Snyder, Jacques, and Francesco Francavilla. Now, this book was a little bit of a offshoot from another Batman event called Batman R.I.P., which Batman, Bruce Wayne was dead. Yeah, I know, it's annoying. However, this book came out, and this was the idea of Dick Grayson, Nightwing, becoming Batman instead. Like, what happened when Bruce Wayne was gone, who becomes Batman, all that. And this was a really interesting story, which unfortunately, this came out like right before the New 52. So after about 12 issues, they had to end it, which was a shame because they had so many great ideas. They introduced so many new characters. And it's still a really good self-contained story. And it is creepy as all hell. Like, the Joker does make an appearance in it, but you do see someone who might as well, if this story had gone on any longer, would have been the Joker to Nightwing's character.
Sounds interesting. Very interesting, actually.
And like I said, that one, it's self-contained. You don't need to read anything before. Just know that Dick Grayson is now Batman. That's all you need to know. All right. Next up is Power Girl by Jimmy Palmiotti, Justin Gray, and Amanda Conner, which two of those people are working on the current Harley Quinn comic that we spoke of earlier. Now, this is the book I mentioned when I said, I know these people can do something really fun, so maybe whatever that draw Harley Quinn naked in a bathtub thing was, it's just really out of context. Because Power Girl, for anyone who doesn't know, and again, this is a little bit stupid, complicated, but she's supposed to be Supergirl of Earth 2, only she's older. Also, that Supergirl was Superman's cousin and all this other crazy nonsense. You don't need to know all that too much. All you need to know is that this is a really funny comic book with a character who is basically has all the powers of Superman, but just dealing with all this crazy nonsense going on in her life. It also has like a story of her trying to like keep her own kind of balance of a secret identity as she's running a corporation, unlike Clark Kent, who's just being a news reporter. It's a really good read, and it's just so goddamn funny. Power Girl, it's a really good book. Trust me on this, it's good. Alright. Next up is another book that was animated, which was The New Frontier. Did you ever watch the animated film?
I think I did. I've seen them all. I just can't remember what happens in that one.
That was the one that it was kind of set in like the 1940s or.
Oh, yeah. And then something lands on Earth and they can't stop it. Yeah, it wasn't too crazy about it.
Yeah, the animated film didn't really do it justice. The comic itself is actually really, really good. The story focuses more on the Martian Manhunter in the comic and like him learning about Earth itself. And you do get like really good scenes with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. But this, for the most part, is a Martian Manhunter story. And it's a really fantastic book. And the art by Darwin Cook is just fantastic to look at, especially since his art style really fits with the time period that this book was set in. But trust me, the movie, if you thought the movie was just okay, check out the book. It was so much better than that. Alright. Now, this next book, I only put it under DC because it technically is owned by DC now. This book has been bouncing around different publishers for a while, but it's really fantastic. It's called Astro City, and it's by Kurt Busiek and Brett Anderson. Now, what this is, it's kind of like a deconstruction of various superhero tropes and whatnot. With this, it's all like, say, it's the Justice League DC world, but with different variations and different introspective looks on the superhero types. And basically, this doesn't follow any one set character. If anything, it does follow more of like the citizens and how they react to the world of superheroes. But then they also have like the counterpoint of what the lives of some of these superheroes are. Like their allegory for Superman is a guy known as the Samaritan. And it talks about that this is a guy who's constantly having to go around, save people's lives, divert natural disaster, and how that literally leaves him with no time to himself. Like it's a really sad moment when he's talking about when he actually has time to sleep. He's dreaming about flying just for fun instead of having to fly from point A to point B because someone's dying in a tsunami. It's a really interesting look on superhero tropes, though. And the series, every so often, does have a larger story arc, but it's never stays on one person for too long. But if you want something just a little bit off-center of superheroes, this is a fantastic choice to start with. Alright, so after that, we got Batwoman, as we mentioned earlier, and this is by Greg Rucka and J.H. Williams. Now, Greg Rucka was the guy who first created this introduction to Batwoman, and he's the one who gave her, like, the majority of her backstory. And this is the one book that was pre-52 before it started. And you can still read some of the other stuff, but if you just want to read this story alone, because I know we talked about earlier the issue of them not wanting to allow the character to have their marriage and their happy endings and all that stuff. But regardless, you can still read this and still get a satisfying story out of it. And last on the DC list, because, man, so much more to go through, people. This is just the end of DC.
Go on.
Next is...
You may have to speed this up a bit as you go along, though.
No.
This is taking an hour on its own, believe it or not.
Oh, yeah. All right. Next up is Batgirl by Brian Q. Miller and Phil Noto. Like, remember that mention I had about that comic books need to be fun? This is that reason on why they need to be fun. Because this was with a character that wasn't Barbara Gordon. This was with a younger character named Stephanie Meyer. What's interesting about this is that it does have her focusing in a little bit on her school life, but also just her, like, actually poking fun at some of the matters that don't make sense about superheroes, even though she's a mass crime fighter herself. But trust me, it's a little odd in some parts, though, but it's a really good read on Batgirl. And it was such a damn shame that when they started the new 52, they just said, oh yeah, that character, she doesn't matter anymore. She doesn't exist, which I call bullshit out on. But regardless, if you can track down the trades, really good stuff. You don't want to miss this. Alright, so that's it with Marvel and DC. But that's not it with the superheroes. So, next up, I got a line of books. I just put down the entire line of it because there is a few things. I don't want to go too much into the individuals of it. But this was a rebooted series called the Valiant line of comic books. A brief history, it started out in the early 90s. They had a bunch of different takes of these new characters, new IPs, all this great stuff. It lasted up until the end of the 90s, and since then hadn't been seen. I don't know fully what happened to it. But last year they started with a new relaunch of it. You don't need to read anything prior to what happened. You can if you want to, but it's not necessary. Now, these are a different breed of superheroes. We got a guy named Exo Manowar, which basically is the idea of what if a barbarian from the old centuries ended up getting alien technology that basically made him like an Iron Man-like character. You got a guy named Bloodshot, who's like their Wolverine, and just a soldier that's been manufactured for war. You got a story about Archer and Armstrong, about a fat guy who's been living for billions of years, teaming up with this kid who was part of some crazy conservative group, and finding out that, yeah, his parents lied about a lot of shit to him, and so the two of them have to team up and take out his parents. If this sounds a little bit like that Hercules comic book I was talking about, that's because this is by those same guys, but regardless, still a great book. We also got a book called Shadow Man, which is a really dark fantasy type book, also really interesting take. And then Quantum and Woody, that's a really funny book about kind of a buddy cop thing of two superheroes. These guys are adopted brothers, but they can't really stand one another, but because of a freak accident, leaves them with these superpowers that they have to recharge by pretty much coming into physical contact with each other once every 24 hours. It's a really funny and silly book, though. It's really worth checking out. Alright. Now I'm going to tell you a few books by the studio Image. This one's considerably shorter, people, which is a good thing. First up was a book called Glory. This was a book I really enjoyed that came out last year. It was a reintroduction of an old character that they had during the 90s. Again, you don't need to read anything about it. This is by a team called Joe Keating and Ross Campbell, who do a fantastic job of introducing this character that originally was just a Wonder Woman knockoff for the Image comic line, but gave her so much more depth and so much more interesting personality. And basically, I don't want to get too much into the story because it is a little complicated to explain. But just trust me, look up the art, and if that art doesn't amaze you, then I don't know what will, because it's a really great book. Next is Dynamo 5 by Jay Faber and Asira. Now, this one's a really interesting book in that in this universe, they had a Superman-like character named Captain Dynamo. And what happened was that he ends up dying. Like, first issue, he's already dead by page 1. Turns out, his wife, who was, like, going through his, like, secret lair to, like, clean up everything after the funeral, finds out for the past several years, he's been cheating on her with many other women. So she does some tracking, and she finds out that this guy has 5 illegitimate children. And this woman, even though she's infuriated with what happened, what her husband did to her, she does recognize that without him, his city is not being protected, so there's supervillains all around just destroying it. She gathers up these 5 kids who each have one part of a superpower that their father had. And essentially they have to work as a team while also realizing that we are a family despite the fact that we come from various backgrounds and all that, and working together to help defend their city. It's a really, really interesting book. Unfortunately, the creator, he stopped working on it after a certain point. I don't know why, but he did at least leave it at a point that he can do more with it if he ever wants to return to it. Alright, so next is Invincible. Now, Don, remember how you kind of questioned about like the silly aspects of why some superheroes allow their villains to live?
Mm-hmm.
This is a book that kind of answers those kind of things. Invincible, when it first started out, it was like a more like kid-friendly affair. But after like the first 4 issues, that's when it does take a much darker turn. As this kid who basically, his father is like the Superman type in this universe, gets his own powers, starts doing his own crime fighting and whatnot. But then by this point, and I don't want to spoil it though, it leads him to like having to answer questions about his own self with the whole matter of being a superhero. And is it okay to let villains live even after they do all this horrible stuff? Or should you just take it in your right to kill them and just do the world a favor? Is that the right thing to do, or is it the wrong thing to do? It's a question he has to conflict with. And the series goes on with some really interesting takes on it and some really interesting developments that they do from time to time. It has been going on for a while now, and it still hasn't ended, but it's still something worth checking out. And if you start feeling like it's faltering, then I guess maybe by that point you should probably just jump off it. Alright. Next is a book called Empowered by Dark Horse, and this is by a writer-artist named Adam Warren. Now, this one is a straight-up comedy about superheroes, and particularly about the tropes of superheroes and female characters. It's kind of a weird backstory, but this guy, Adam Warren, he used to do work for hire commissions, and basically, he had some dude apparently commission him multiple times to draw some superhero character in bondage with her clothes all ripped up. So this guy, he starts like questioning about like making a story about that, like all about that. And so what you get out of it is actually a story of a girl trying to be a superhero, but feeling like she's a joke all the time because she gets captured and tied up and all that. Which I know sounds very misogynistic and it sounds really awkward, but trust me, this book goes into some really interesting areas. It's actually a very female positive and empowering book. I know it sounds really odd and the art is very cheesecakey-like, but just take my word on it, because this book has been going on for like several volumes and it's won awards, people. If it's winning awards and people are not calling it like a sexist piece of shit, then you know that this thing is actually doing something right.
You're going to wish I edited this, but I ain't going to. I can tell you that.
Okay, people. Because I am getting really, really raspy because I am talking so much about these, I'm going to still leave up the entire list that I think you should read. I'm just going to now only hit on the key ones that I really want to talk about. And also, not only that, time is of the essence, so I gotta wrap this up pretty quick. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the superheroes, except for one book called Shark Knife, but trust me, look that up, it's a fun book. Alright, so moving over, this is now no longer superhero books, this is all different genres. Okay, first up, we got crime and noir. The first book I want to talk about, The Punisher by Garth Ennis. This is not the Punisher that's in like the Marvel universe with all that stuff. It's the same character, but it's not connected to any of that. So it's not in continuity, it's not canon, whatever. This is more of like the realistic look of what the Punisher is like. Like this isn't all the flashy supervillains and crazy nonsense and high octane fun. This is a crime story of the Punisher as like he is a force of nature throughout the crime underworld. Really interesting. Like, oddly enough, you really don't spend a whole lot of time with the Punisher himself. You more spend it with the people he's going to end up killing, which is an interesting thing, but really, really worth checking out. After that, Blacksad. If you've ever heard of this, it's really worth checking out. It's a little odd when you look at the art, which the writer and the artist, their names are both in Spanish, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so I apologize. But this is a book with anthropomorphic animal-like characters, but it is not meant to be like a kid's thing. It is like a real crime noir in like the sense of something like The Big Sleep or any of those books by Raymond Chandler. And it has beautiful art. The animal characters, although odd, they're very expressive, and it just works so well together. After that, I'm going to talk about Criminal, which is kind of a more like an anthology series, like by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillip. These are just short, contained stories about different criminals in this city. It's kind of like the book Sin City, only not as over the top and trying to be hyper octane and whatnot. This is like more like true crimes that are believable. And they mainly do like 5-issue arcs, so it's always going to be something different after a while. You do see like repeating characters and running themes though, but still worth checking out. Alright. And something completely different is Chew by John Layman and Rob Guillory. It is considered a crime comic, but it's also a really, really fucking funny comic book. This is a story about John Chew, who's a police officer who has the ability that if he eats something, he can see its entire past behind it. And he's not the only one. This is a world where there are all these people with these ridiculous food-based powers. You got people who can like speak through their meals. Got a guy who can paint something to look so good you can taste the food, and so on and so forth. Now, it is super ridiculous. It's really funny, and it's still ongoing right now, but it is a fantastic book, and I highly recommend checking it out. And there's so much more of a bigger story, I just can't go into it right now. Oh, but I will say to a bigger thing of it, this is a world where chicken has been outlawed. Like, just think about how ridiculous that sounds, but then think about criminals committing crimes to steal chickens, and just think about how funny that is for a moment. Trust me, it's worth checking out. Alright, now I'm going to touch on a few books from the horror, dark fantasy, and fantasy settings. One of the big ones to talk about, of course, is Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I talked about the Swamp Thing earlier. This one's just as good, but this one is more of a dark take on it, so really worth checking out. Sandman by Neil Gaiman and Sam Keith. If you haven't heard about it, this is also a fantastic book series. Also, the one I want to talk about the most, though, is I Kill Giants. This, I do classify it as a bit of a fantasy and a bit of horror, though. This is a story about a young girl who is in the modern world, and she's claiming that she's getting ready to kill some giant. No one knows what she's talking about. It's really odd. She's a strange little girl. When you see the story and how it plays out, it is a really, like, heart-tugging, sad, and emotional story. I'll freely admit, I nearly cried reading this. And I've read this thing, like, multiple times, and I still cry every time it gets to this one point. But a fantastic book. It's by Joe Kelly and Kim Nimura, who's, I believe, a Korean artist, or Filipino, whatever, it doesn't matter. Point is, I highly recommend this book. If anything else, you gotta check this out. Alright, going into SciFi Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. This is a big space opera type story with a little bit of Romeo and Juliet in it. And I mentioned Fiona Staples earlier. She's a fantastic artist. I've talked about Brian K. Vaughan already with the Runaways. So you know this guy's good already. This is just a fantastic series. It's really worth checking out. And it's so crazy in their concept of sci-fi that there's nothing else on the stand that's like it. Alright, this is an older book. It's called Transmetropolitan by Warren Ellis and Derek Robinson. If you've ever seen Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, basically take that same character of Hunter S. Thompson in a really crazy, whacked out future society, which has like crazy elements like you would see in Judge Dredd almost of what the future holds. And it has a really good political message to it. It's also just humorous and crazy and violent. It's so fantastic. There's just no words for it other than go read this. It's good. All right. Also, a quick one is a comic called Red Rocket 7. Basically, think Forrest Gump if he was actually a cloned alien who's been living throughout several decades, learning about different music from America. Also a really good work. Now I got a few books that I just classified as drama and other. The big ones to talk about, Why the Last Man by Brian K. Vaughan again. I've already talked about him. You know he's good. And forget the artist's name, but his last name is Guar. Now, this is a really interesting story. Basically, just one day, all the men on Earth just die. Every single one of them. Except for one dude and a monkey. When I say all males, I mean like animals too. The cows, the dogs, all of them. Anything with a Y chromosome is dead, but these two. They don't know why. Some people may think, hey, that's going to be paradise because you're going to have tons and tons of women want to have sex with you. No, you have no idea, because that means that he is now pretty much a object to be prized and commoditized. Or also, you know, some women might think, hey, maybe God wanted all the men to die. Oh, here's the last man, we got to make sure he's dead too. Really, really interesting look into this dystopian setting. Really fantastic book to read. Another one that's worth talking about, Day Tripper by Gabriel Barr and Fabio Moon. These are two twin brothers who are based in Brazil. Now, this is basically a story about one guy named Braz, and it shows different points of his life, but the catch is, like, they're showing what if he died at this point in his life, how it reflects on him as a person, but then, like, in another issue where it's saying, like, well, what if he didn't die? What would happen in his life there? This is a really interesting take, and it's one of these books that really makes you kind of stop and think, like, how you appreciate your own life, because you never know when you're going to die, essentially. There's just so many great stories in it, like him dealing with the matter of his family, or, like, him wondering if he's ever going to find true love, or, like, after he finds these things, like, then what about, like, what's it mean when you lose connections with your friends, or what happens when you have your firstborn child, all this stuff. It's a fantastic read, also a very emotional book. I'll admit I cried a few times reading it. It's good. Also, another one that made me cry so much, Too Cool to Be Forgotten by James Robinson. A really kind of a crazy plot setup. Basically, a guy, he's trying to quit smoking, but he can't seem to figure out why he can't stop. So his wife convinces him to go through hypnotherapy. So while he's being hypnotized, he suddenly wakes up and he's back in his high school days. He doesn't know why, but he's thinking, well, maybe I just got to change what made me start smoking in the first place, and that'll be it. It's really not. It also has a very huge emotional gut punch to it that just thinking about makes me cry every time I look at it. Alright, now something that's not going to make you cry is Infinite Kung Fu by Kagan McLeod. If you are a fan of Samurai Champloo, this is a book for you. Because this is like a crazy take on Kung Fu films from the 70s and 80s with like a really crazy hyperized style with also like this fantasy element of zombies and whatnot. It's a one and done volume monk, kind of like big size book. It's really fun to read. Okay, and that's it, people. Like I said, I still have a huge list of things. I will recommend, please, please, please look at them. I wish I could talk to you about all of them, but I really don't have the voice for it anymore, and I don't want to waste any more time of Dawn.
I bet you thought I was dead. I bet you thought I was sleeping. I'm still here. I just had to be silent. There was a couple of times I wanted to say something, but I had to let you finish because, time is pressing on. I could push this longer. I could have made you finish, but, I have to stop sometime. But, Joe, believe it or not, I know a lot of people might think this guy should have edited this down, but you know what? There are some people that would want to know. And I'm going to leave everything. I'm going to edit it down a little bit, but I'm not going to cut off anything you said. It's going to take a while, but anyway, people don't need to know all that. Right.
I'm so sorry that I made the list so big, but I got so many books I want people to check out that are just so good. There's a little bit for everyone. So, like I said, if you're not into superheroes, try one of the other books.
I heard more than a few things that I personally want to check out. Even some of the superhero stuff that I thought was really cool. So I appreciate that. You've sent me the links. The links are going to be in the description as well. Hopefully you sent me all of them. If you didn't, I'm sure you will be sending them to me because you'll have plenty of time before I put this up. I've got a lot of editing to do.
Yeah.
But now I'm going to move on. I had some recommendations, but to be honest with you, most of them are in the manga list. I'm sure people have got enough recommendations from the comics. There's only one thing I was going to recommend that isn't in the must-see manga list, and that's a manga called, and get ready for the name, people, because I know it's going to, as soon as I say the name, people are going to be like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? The name of the manga is called Masturbation Master Kurosawa. And basically, I'll explain, because yes, the name does pretty much say it all. It's about a deviant kid in high school who masturbates about girls that he thinks about. Now, for a teenager, this isn't very unusual, so you shouldn't really surprise people. The only thing that makes this different is that he does it in school, and he does it in the girls' toilet. Now, this is not a hentai by any means. This is actually a drama, because basically, if you've seen anime like Welcome to the NHK or read the manga, it's a book about social deviance. And basically, I'll just give you the synopsis. It's about a boy who masturbates in his toilets about girls he fantasizes in his class, which again is not a big deal. But then he gets blackmailed by one of the girls in his class, and he gets blackmailed into into punishing the people that are bullying the girl that's blackmailing him. And she starts making him do things to get the bullies back. Things start to escalate, and it's a really good story about people with problems. It's not really that complex. It's not as complex as Welcome to the NHK. They're teenagers, and it's something relatable about it. I mean, yeah, the guy's a little bit of a pervert, but he's not hurting anyone. He doesn't go. It's not vaping. It's nothing like that. It really isn't that extreme, and it ends on a really nice, redeeming note. And the moral of the whole story ends on a really good note. I was really impressed with this manga. I think it's not even like a real manga. It's more like a fan fiction thing. I'm probably going to link directly to the manga because I don't think you can even buy it anywhere. I think it was a web series this guy created, but it's got a lot of high ratings, and obviously when I saw the name I was hesitant myself, but people assured me that it wasn't a hentai manga and it was actually a very good story. And if you like offbeat mangas that are based on realistic characters, then you should check this out. I know the name sounds ridiculous, but don't judge a book by its cover. So, and apart from that, all the other manga I would mention is already in our must-see manga list, which I would recommend. So, I know, how did that sound, Joe? Crazy? Too crazy for you?
I can't speak right now.
That's fine. Well, you take a drink and you get your breath, because I got a lot of talking to do anyway, because I'm going to wrap this up. And I just want to wrap this up with some closing thoughts, people, and some suggestive links. Now, I just want to wrap this up to say, I'm not a fan of monopolies and entertainment anymore. We live in the YouTube, Twitter, independent, do-it-yourself generation. We've got so many ways of getting comics, mangas, anime for free. Test what you like. You don't always have to buy what you like. You can steal if you want, but, we want to try to support the creators of these things. So we're always going to try to point out links to the Amazon page or stuff like that. But, sometimes, and I hate to say this, but when things are out of print and you just can't find it, you got to do what you got to do. I'm sorry. I really don't like promoting, piracy, but if it's out of print and you can't buy it and you want to support it, you want to get it the word of mouth, try to check it out online. Try to find the best way to support it after you've seen it. And, that's basically what I can say. But we said this before. When it comes to manga versus comics, they both got great things to offer. Hopefully, we've been somewhat informative. I hope we've been trying to be somewhat unbiased, try to look at both sides of the spectrum. I'm sure a lot of people have comments. Hopefully, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put timestamps in the podcast. So for Joel's very long, comprehensive comic overview, I'll put timestamps there. So if you want to skip the whole thing, you can, which, I would hope you wouldn't, because, but some people might just not be interested in recommendations, and they might just want to hear the conversation. So there will be timestamps in the podcast so you can just hear the conversation. And I do want to say, me and Joe are Tyros. Basically, we're both kind of new to what we're doing here, to reading comics and manga. We're both learning as well. I do want to always point people in the direction of places where they can get better information, as usual. Now, I mentioned Catmick before. He made quite a few blogs on this on Anime Vice about the whole comics versus manga scene. Those links are going to be in there. There's a video that the Vice Pit did on Anime Vice about comics versus manga. I'll link that in there. A great site to check out, all things comics, comicvine.com. They're the sister site of Anime Vice. They talk about all the latest comics. They have so many comics, forums, threads, users, all of that shit. I'm sure you guys can think of 100 other sites. Now, here's a YouTube channel that is doing exactly what we're trying to do today on these last 2 episodes, called Variant. Variant is the comic show made on revision3.com. Now, it's done by Arias Quinones. If I'm saying your names wrong, sir, please forgive me. He does comic overviews. He gives recommendations. He gets you into a lot of the recommendations Joe's made. I noticed he's already mentioned them as well. But entry level show to get you into comic, really cool. I'll put the link in the description. I've seen some great things. He's done some great stuff as well. Now, what also I want to talk about, the Legal Extremely Gentlemen. They had a whole podcast for about 5 or 6 years talking about comics. I'm going to put the links to their podcast archive in there as well. Check out all their old episodes. They only ended the podcast this year, but feel free to go back in the past and listen to all of them, because I'm pretty sure they mentioned so much stuff Joe mentioned, as well as other recommendations from comic aficionados, people working in the industry. They had interviews. They're also still on Spill.com. They just don't currently have a comic podcast at the moment, but who knows, when the site comes back, they might have something new. They've mentioned it before, but for now. But also, I should also mention, those guys have branched off into their own thing called, what's it called, Joe?
oneofus.net. And that's where they got the new Leog, in a sense, with the original gentleman.
Yes. So my mistake. The One of Us guys are basically it's the evolution of the Leog. They go to oneofus.net and you can get the newer updates on there. But Legal Extraordinary Gentlemen was the original show, and now they've got One of Us with the show called The Original Gentleman, which, yes, I was aware of, but I just haven't gone there as much because they kind of seem to be in an odd place with Spill kind of going through transition, and that site kind of just starting up very slowly. So, but anyway, last couple things I want to mention is there are some really great documentaries on comics and manga. Now, 2 of them in particular are ones I would really like to recommend, but they're just not released yet. They are finished, but they're still in post-production. One of them is called Comics Undressed, where they have a whole look at the industry and speak about a lot of the things that me and Joe kind of alluded to, but they go into more details. You hear from the experts, a lot of the things. When you go to the Kickstarter pages that I put the links up on, they have trailers which kind of show you that a lot of the things me and Joe spoke about, they're actually hitting on, but coming directly from the creators, from the professionals in the comic industry. The second documentary is called The Untold Tales of the Comic Industry. This is another interesting look at a lot of the prejudice in the comic industry, a lot of the smaller indie comic companies that aren't getting recognized, a lot of racism in the industry, a lot of sexism in the industry, a lot of things that are holding the independent artists down. These 2 documentaries I'm really looking forward to. Now, what I will say, I found a whole slew of other comic documentaries, but those were dedicated to particular comic artists, and I kind of wanted more of a broad scope, but if you want to list them, there's The Mindscape of Alan Moore, In Search of Steve Ditko by Jonathan Ross, The Cartoonist, Jeff Smith, Bane and Changing Face of the Comics, Grant Morrison, Talking with Gods, Adventures into Digital Comics, and Stripped, the comics documentary by Fred Strader, if I'm saying your name right. Anyway, people, if you didn't follow what I just said, don't worry about it. All going to be in the links, but just going to quickly run through it because we are running out of time. Now, those are the comics documentaries. There's 2 manga documentaries that I found. The main one is Manga Mad. This one's already on YouTube for free. And the thing I like about Manga Mad is taken from the Japanese perspective. It isn't an American or English documentarian going out to Japanese giving you their perspective. It's done by the Japanese to tell you how things are in Japan about the manga and anime industry. I watched this recently before the podcast, and people make a lot of preconceptions about manga and anime, a lot of negative ones. And when I watched this documentary by the Japanese, funny enough, it kind of, I don't want to use the word reinforced it, but it kind of confirmed a lot of the things that people have even misconceived about the Japanese. And I like the way they embrace it, but also explain how the Japanese don't see things the way the Western world does. And that's where a lot of cultural misconception, confusion, and prejudices come into play. But that Manga Mad documentary is excellent. It was made in 2008, still relevant today. Really cool. Check it out. Link going to be in the description. And the second manga documentary, which isn't even half as good, admittedly, is a UK manga documentary. And the reason why it's not half as good because it was made in 1992. And it was a UK one. And I watched it, and most of it is, I've seen a lot more updated stuff. It's just kind of old and outdated. So you can watch it if you want. It was made by the UK celebrity Jonathan Ross. And it's called just UK Manga. So that's weird. And I think that's pretty much it, Joe. I'm sure if I'm forgetting anything, I'll just have to add it in the links, kind of rushing to end. You still alive, Joe?
Yeah, I'm still here.